What if the girl everyone laughed at became the only person brave enough to expose the truth? Abby Miller was humiliated in front of an entire schoolhouse, told she was born for mud, not books. But one cruel insult lit a fire inside her that no rich man, corrupt schoolmaster, or stolen contract could put out. This is a story about dignity, education, and the power of one woman learning to read the very words meant to imprison her. If you believe knowledge can change a life, please like, comment,
share, and subscribe before the story begins.
The June sun beat down on Sweetwater Creek like a blacksmith's hammer. Heat waves danced off the red dirt road, inside the one-room schoolhouse. The air was thick. It smelled of chalk dust, old pine, and nervous sweat. Abby Miller stared straight ahead, 18 years old, squeezed into a desk built for a 10-year-old. Her knees bumped the splintered wood. Her faded cotton dress was scrubbed clean, but threadbare at the elbows. She sat in the back row, surrounded by children half her age, half her size. She didn't care. She had waited her whole life for this morning. Her baby brother was finally old enough to watch the house, so here she was. Heart hammering against her ribs, ready. Schoolmaster Thaddeus Stone paced the front of the room. His silver pocket watch ticked, a sharp, unforgiving sound. He didn't like her being there. You could see it in the tight line of his jaw to him. She was just a dirt farmer's girl. Dust on his polished boots. "Miss Miller," he said. The room went dead quiet. "To the board, if you please." Abby stood. Her worn boots scuffed the floorboards. She walked to the front. The chalkboard loomed large. A simple sentence written in white dust. She stared at it. The letters twisted. They coiled and uncoiled, like rattlesnakes in the sun. Her throat went bone dry. She bit the inside of her cheek, hard. The metallic taste of blood grounded her, but the words wouldn't come. Her mind was a blank slate. Silence stretched. A little boy giggled in the second row. Stone smiled. It was a thin, cruel thing. It didn't reach his eyes. "Look closely, children," he said. His voice echoed off the timber walls, loud and deliberate. "Here is proof that some people are born only for the mud. The Lord builds the plow horse, and he builds the thoroughbred. Education is a refined tool. It is not meant for hands covered in pig slop. A school is a place for minds, not beasts of burden." He looked right at her, right through her. "Do not waste our paper and ink, Miss Miller. Go back to your pigs." Abby didn't flinch. She didn't drop her head. She turned. Her spine was a rod of iron. She walked down the center aisle. Every step measured, deliberate. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of a tear. Not here. Not in front of them. The shame burned in her chest, hot as a branding iron. But she swallowed it down. Outside, she stopped by the great oak tree, just out of sight, that S when the first tear fell. Just one. She wiped it away fast with a calloused thumb. Across the road, sitting atop a massive chestnut gelding, was William Vance, 25 years old, owner of the biggest ranch in the county. He hadn't just been riding by. He'd stopped. He'd listened through the open window. Will watched her. He saw the tremor in her shoulders, but he also saw the set of her jaw, the sheer unbroken pride of a cornered wildcat. He knew that look. He'd seen it in his own mirror a few years back, when the so-called educated men of Boston tried to strip his dying father of everything he owned. He didn't pity her. Pity was for the weak. He respected her. Will tipped his hat just a fraction. She didn't see him. She just kept walking toward the river. Sundown. The Miller shack sat by the creek, sagging under its own weight inside. The smell of cheap whiskey and boiled cabbage hung heavy in the air. Abby was scrubbing an iron pot. Her father, Thomas, sat by the cold hearth. "Told you so," Thomas muttered. He stared into a tin cup, eyes glassy. "Books ain't for us, Abby. Ain't no point. We're dirt. Best get used to the taste." Before she could answer, a heavy knock rattled the wooden door. Thomas frowned. He set the cup down and pulled the door open. William Vance stood on the porch. The pale moonlight caught the silver buckle of his belt. His face was unreadable, carved out of stone. "Mr. Miller," Will said. His voice was steady. "Lo, I am William Vance." Thomas swallowed hard. He wiped a dirty hand on his trousers. "I know who you are. We ain't on your land." "No, you aren't," Will said. He stepped inside without being asked. He didn't look at Thomas. He looked straight at Abby. "I need a hand at my ranch," Will said. "Kitchen work. Herb garden. You know plants. I can see it in the way you keep that patch outside. The pay is 50 cents a day, double the going rate." Thomas' eyes lit up. "She'll take it. There's a condition." Will added. He kept his eyes locked on Abby. From 3 to 5 in the afternoon. She's off the clock, because she'll be sitting on my front porch. Abby frowned. The scrub brush froze in her hand. Doing what? Will held her gaze. Learning to read. The room went dead silent. You could hear the creek running outside. I saw what happened today, Will said. His voice dropped a notch. That teacher thinks a person's worth is written on a piece of paper. He's a fool. Dignity isn't something a man can hand you, and it sure as hell isn't something a schoolmaster can take away. You have a brain, Miss Miller. I don't care who your daddy is, or how much money is in your pocket. A mind is a terrible thing to let rot just because some arrogant man told you it should. Abby gripped the rim of the iron pot. Her knuckles went white. Why do you care? Will said. He turned back toward the door. I've seen educated men act like animals, and I've seen unlettered men act like kings. Reading is just a weapon. It's time you learned how to hold it. He paused in the doorway. Be at my gate by sunrise, Miss Miller. He walked out into the Texas night. The sound of his horse's hooves faded into the dark. Abby stood by the wash basin, her heart hammered against her ribs. She looked down at her rough, calloused hands, hands built for the mud, hands built for labor. Then she looked out the open door, toward the open sky. The letters had beaten her today, but tomorrow was a brand new day. The sun had not yet cleared the horizon when Abby reached the iron gates of Vance Ranch. The sky was a bruised purple. The air was cool. Carrying the scent of dew-heavy sage and damp earth, she stood before the two-story house. It was the largest structure she had ever seen, painted a stark, clean white. It looked like a monument against the open Texas sky. Her boots were covered in dust from the 3-mile walk. Her fingers clutched the straps of her canvas satchel. She felt small. She felt like an interloper. Don't just stand there like a wooden post, girl. The voice came from the wide wooden porch. A woman stepped out. She was large-framed. Her silver hair pulled back into a knot so tight it seemed to pull the skin of her cheekbones taut. She wore a crisp gray apron. This was Mrs. Clara. Abby swallowed her nerves. She walked up the porch steps, her spine straight. I'm Abby Miller. Mr. Vance told me I know what William told you, Mrs. Clara interrupted. She didn't smile, but her eyes weren't cruel either. They were gray and sharp, assessing Abby in 3 seconds flat. She looked at Abby's worn dress, then down at her hands. Mrs. Clara reached out. She grabbed Abby's right hand, turned it over. Abby tried to pull back, but the older woman's grip was firm. Mrs. Clara ran a thumb over the thick yellow calluses on Abby's palm. Good, Mrs. Clara said, releasing her. You know what a hard day's labor feels like. Out here, we don't have room for soft hands or fragile spirits. The stove is hot. The floors need scrubbing. Follow me. She handed Abby a heavy canvas apron. There were no gentle words, no false welcomes. Abby tied the apron around her waist. She followed the older woman into the kitchen. The work began immediately. It was heavy, relentless labor, kneading dough, lugging cast iron pots, scrubbing the pine floors until her knees ached. But Abby didn't complain. She worked with a quiet, fierce efficiency. By noon, Mrs. Clara set a plate of cold beef and biscuits on the table. Take 20 minutes, she said. Abby sat. Her arms trembled slightly from the heavy lifting. Through the kitchen window she saw the back tract of the ranch. There was a fenced garden plot. It was overgrown. Thistles and wild mustard had choked out the rows, but beneath the weeds, Abby recognized the distinct, serrated leaves of wild rosemary. She saw the pale purple flowers of thyme struggling for light. It was a garden her mother would have loved. Without asking, Abby finished her biscuit and walked out into the midday heat. She didn't use a hoe. She knelt in the dirt. Her fingers dug into the dry soil, tracing the roots of the weeds. She pulled them gently, ensuring she didn't disturb the delicate root systems of the herbs. She trimmed the dead wood from the rosemary bushes using her fingers. She patted the loose earth around the thyme. To anyone else, it looked like simple yard work. To Abby, it was a conversation with the earth. You have a knack for that. Abby jumped. William Vance stood by the wooden fence. He had a coiled lariat over his shoulder. His linen shirt was damp with sweat, his face shadowed by his wide-brimmed hat. He had been watching her. Abby wiped her brow with the back of her hand, leaving a streak of dark mud. The weeds were choking the life out of them, she said defensively. They just needed a little room to breathe. Will nodded slowly. He stepped closer, leaning his forearms against the top rail of the fence. Most folks look at a patch of ground and just see dirt, Will said. His voice was a low rumble. They think you only get value out of something if you smash it down and force it to grow. But you look at what's already there. You listen to what the land is trying to do. He looked at her, his eyes serious beneath the brim of his hat. That's what real intelligence is, Abby. Will said clearly. It isn't about memorizing things out of a leather-bound volume. It's about understanding the nature of things, the way the world fits together. You already have that. Don't let anyone make you feel ignorant just because you don't know the names men gave to those letters. Abby looked down at the rosemary plant. The scent was sharp and clean on her fingers. Chalk dust doesn't smell like this, she murmured. No, Will said, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. It doesn't. Wash your hands, it's 3 o'clock. The front porch was shadowed now. A small wooden table had been placed between two wicker chairs. On the table sat a small slate board, a piece of white chalk, and a rag. Mrs. Clara sat in the far corner, a basket of mending in her lap. Her rocking chair creaked rhythmically. A silent sentinel. Abby sat in one chair, her knees felt stiff. Will sat opposite her. He didn't look like a teacher. He looked like a man about to break a difficult horse. He picked up the chalk. He drew a single letter on the slate. It was a simple shape, two diagonal lines meeting at a point with a bar across the middle. This is A, Will said. Abby looked at it. Instantly, her chest tightened. The white lines on the black stone began to shift. The schoolhouse walls seemed to close in around her. She could hear the echo of Thaddeus Stone's voice. Go back to your pigs. Her hand began to shake. She gripped the edge of her skirt. Will stopped. He looked at the slate, then at her face. He didn't push. He didn't sigh. He picked up the rag and wiped the slate clean. Let's try something else, Will said softly. He stood up. Come with me. Abby followed him down the porch steps and toward the stables. The air inside the barn was warm and rich with the smell of sweet hay, leather, and horse sweat. In the first stall stood his massive chestnut gelding. The horse pricked its ears and nickered softly. Will walked to the side of the stall. He picked up a piece of white chalk from a tool chest. Right there, on the rough, dark timber of the horse's stall, he drew the letter C. Look at the horse, Abby, Will said. What's his name? Chestnut, she replied. Her voice small. Chestnut, Will repeated. He pointed to the letter on the wood. This is C. It makes the sound at the front of his name. Look at the curve of it. It looks like a horseshoe turned on its side. See it? Abby looked. She looked at the horse's wide, intelligent eyes. She looked at the chalk line on the familiar wood. The snakes in her mind stopped coiling. The timber didn't feel like a schoolhouse. It felt real. See, Abby whispered. That's it, Will said. He handed her the chalk. Now you draw it. Abby's fingers were stiff. She pressed the chalk against the wood. She drew the curve. It was shaky, but it was there. Good, Will said. Now, look over there. What's that plant by the door? Clover, Abby said. Starts with the same sound, Will said, his voice encouraging. Draw it again, right next to the first one. Abby drew another C. This time, her hand didn't shake. They stayed in the barn until the sun began to sink below the hills. By the time they stopped, Abby had learned 3 letters, C for chestnut, H for hay, B for barn. They weren't abstract shapes anymore. They were pieces of her world. When it was time to leave, Will walked her to the gate. You did well today, he said. Abby looked out at the road leading back to her father's shack. It didn't hurt as much, she admitted. Will leaned against the gatepost. Learning shouldn't be a beating, Abby. A real teacher doesn't use knowledge like a whip to keep people down. They use it like a lantern to show you the path. Don't ever forget that. Abby walked home in the twilight. When she reached the creek near her house, she stopped. She found a smooth, flat stone by the water. Using a sharp pebble, she scratched the letter C into the surface. She looked at it for a long time before she walked inside. 2 weeks passed like the turning of pages in a heavy book. Abby's days settled into a rigorous rhythm. The mornings belonged to Mrs. Clara and the unending demands of the house. Abby's arms grew stronger from the lifting. The herb garden blossomed under her care, the rows neat and free of weeds. Mrs. Clara didn't praise her with words, but Abby noticed a thick slice of apple pie left on the counter every afternoon at 2:55. At 3 o'clock, the porch became a sanctuary. Will was a patient man, but he was also demanding. He didn't let her slack. They moved through the alphabet, connecting each letter to something tangible. R for rivers, for sage, M for mint. Abby's mind was like dry earth soaking up rain. She had a natural photographic memory. Once she connected a letter to a physical object. She never forgot it, but there was a barrier. She could recognize the letters individually. She could call them out by name. But whenever Will tried to string them together into a short sentence on the paper ledger, something inside Abby's mind fractured. It happened on a Tuesday. The air was heavy, promising a summer storm. Will placed a clean sheet of paper on the table. He had written a single, short sentence in neat, block letters. The horse runs fast. All right, Abby, Will said gently. You know every one of these shapes. Take your time. String them together. Abby leaned forward. She looked at the first word, THE. Her mind identified the letters, but when she tried to push them together to form a sound, the world went dark. The white paper seemed to expand. The black ink blurred. A cold sweat broke out on the back of her neck. Her ears began to ring. She wasn't on the porch anymore. She was 10 years old again. It was winter. The wind was howling through the gaps in the cabin logs. Abby. Will's voice sounded like it was coming from the bottom of a deep well. Abby stood up abruptly. Her chair scraped loudly against the porch floorboards. Her breathing was shallow. She knocked the ledger off the table. The paper fluttered into the dirt. "I can't," she choked out. Her hands were pressed against her temples. "I can't do it. The letters, they aren't words. They're just ghosts." Mrs. Clara stopped her rocking chair. The creaking ceased. Will didn't reach for the paper. He didn't stand up. He remained seated, his face calm, his hands resting flat on the table. "Abby," he said, his voice steady as an anchor. "Look at me, not the paper. Look at me." Abby forced her eyes to meet his. Her chest was heaving. "Sit down," Will said softly. "Nobody is judging you here. Nobody is going to yell. Just breathe." Abby slowly sank back into the chair. Her heart was a trapped bird in her ribs. Will leaned forward. He picked up the piece of chalk from the table. He didn't write a letter. He just held it. "You aren't struggling because you're stupid, Abby," Will said, his eyes drilling into hers. "You're struggling because you're carrying a weight you haven't told me about. Your mind isn't refusing the letters. It's refusing the place those letters take you. Have you ever tried to learn before?" Abby closed her eyes. The memory burst through the dam she had built in her mind for 8 long years. "My mother," Abby whispered. A tear slipped down her cheek, hot and fast. She knew how to read. She had a small Bible, a green leather one. Every winter night she'd sit me by the hearth. We'd look at the words together. I was starting to understand. I was doing good. She opened her eyes, looking out at the distant hills. Her voice went flat, unemotional. The sound of a person recounting a nightmare they had lived through 1,000 times. "It was October," Abby said. "A spooked stallion came tearing through the yard. My mother went out to grab the lead rope. The horse, it reared. It struck her down, right in front of me. She died in the dirt in less than a minute. And that Bible, it was right there in her hand. Covered in mud, covered in her blood." Silence fell over the porch. The only sound was the distant rumble of thunder. "Every time I look at a sentence," Abby said, her voice cracking, "every time the letters line up, I see that green Bible. I see her on the ground. My brain, it just shuts down. It's like it's trying to keep me from going back to that day." Will didn't move. He didn't offer a hollow phrase of sympathy. He knew better. He looked down at his own calloused hands. "When I was 21, I was sitting in a grand library in Boston," Will said quietly, "surrounded by thousands of leather-bound books. I thought I was king of the world. Then a telegram came. My father had died of a sudden stroke back here in Texas. The shock of it, it broke something in me. For 3 months after that, I couldn't open a book. Every time I smelled old paper, my throat closed up. I thought I'd lost my mind." Abby looked at him, surprised. "Your mind is a powerful thing, Abby," Will said, his voice rich with understanding. "It builds walls to keep the pain out. That trauma didn't make you ignorant. It didn't take away your ability to think. It just tied your literacy to your grief. But you aren't that helpless 10-year-old girl anymore. You're a grown woman, and you can choose to walk through that wall." He stood up. He walked into the house and returned a moment later. He didn't have a book. He had a clean slate board. He handed it to her along with the chalk. "We're throwing away the printed books for now," Will said. "We aren't reading other men's words. You're going to write your own. Write something you love. Write something that belongs to you." Abby gripped the chalk. She thought of the garden. She thought of her mother's soft voice before the storm. Slowly, painfully, she pressed the chalk to the slate. She wrote the letters one by one, Mother. She stared at the word. It was her mother's name. It wasn't covered in blood. It was clean, white chalk on black stone, written by her own hand. Her hand shook. But this time it wasn't from fear. It was from the sheer, overwhelming weight of release. She wiped her nose quickly with her sleeve, pretending the wind had blown dust into her eyes. In the corner, Mrs. Clara blew her nose loudly into a white handkerchief. Will sat back in his chair. He looked at the slate, then up at Abby. "Words have power, Abby," Will said, his voice low and firm. "They can lock you in a cage of past grief, or they can give you the key to get out. You just claimed your mother's memory back from the dirt. That's what education does. It gives you the power to define your own life, instead of letting your tragedies define it for you." The first drops of rain began to fall, fat and heavy against the tin roof of the porch. Abby looked down at the words she had written. The wall was still there, but for the first time in 8 years, she saw a doorway. A small town has eyes like a hawk and a tongue like a whip. By the third week of July, the whispers had traveled down the red dirt road from Vance Ranch straight into the heart of Sweetwater Creek. Folks at the general store talked. Men over their whiskey at the saloon chewed on the news. William Vance is spending his afternoons teaching that illiterate Miller girl how to read. To some, it was a scandalous waste of time. To others, it felt like an insult to the town's natural order. The heat that Thursday afternoon was oppressive. The air felt thick enough to choke a horse. Abby was sitting at the wooden table on the front porch, working through a list of basic nouns. When the sound of iron shoes clattered against the gravel driveway, a sleek black buggy pulled up to the hitching post. Thaddeus Stone stepped down. He looked exactly as he did in the schoolhouse, dressed in a crisp black wool suit that seemed to defy the Texas heat, his gold-rimmed spectacles catching the glare of the sun. He adjusted his cuffs. He walked up the porch steps with a slow, deliberate arrogance. Mrs. Clara's rocking chair came to a sudden halt. The rhythmic creaking died. "Good afternoon, Clara," Stone said. His voice smooth as silk and twice as cold. He turned his gaze toward Abby, his eyes narrowing slightly behind his lenses. "Miss Miller, I see you found a new place to spend your days." Abby felt her stomach drop. Her fingers tightened around her chalk slate. But she didn't look down. She forced herself to look him right in the eye. Before she could speak, the front screen door creaked open. Will Vance stepped out. He was carrying a leather ledger under his arm, his shirt sleeves rolled up to his elbows. His face was unreadable, but there was a dangerous stillness in his posture. "Thaddeus," Will said. His voice was a low, quiet rumble. "You read a long way from your blackboard. I came as a matter of familial concern." "William," Stone said, spreading his hands wide. He took a step closer to the table, looking down at the slate board. "The town is talking. People are uneasy. It is one thing to show charity to the less fortunate. It is quite another to upset the social equilibrium of this community." Will leaned his shoulder against the porch post. "He didn't invite Stone to sit the social equilibrium," Will repeated slowly. "That's a grand phrase for a Thursday afternoon." Stone sighed, a sound of heavy, patronizing disappointment. He looked directly at Abby, then back to Will. "Let us be entirely frank, nephew," Stone said. "Education is a privilege earned by heritage and station. It requires a specific capacity of mind. When you attempt to lift someone beyond their natural calling, you do them no favors. You merely breed discontent. Some minds are meant to labor in the field, William. To force them into a world of letters only brings confusion and misery to their lives." Abby felt the old shame rising in her throat, hot and choking. She looked down at the table. Will didn't yell. He didn't reach for his gun. He took 2 steps forward, positioning his tall frame directly between Stone and Abby. "You always did know how to hide ugly thoughts behind beautiful words, Thaddeus," Will said. His voice was terrifyingly calm. "But a lie dressed in silk is still a lie. Chasing a girl out of a schoolhouse doesn't protect the community. It protects your own fragile ego. You think because you spent 4 years reading Latin in Boston, you're a better man than the folks who bleed into this soil." Stone's face flushed a deep, angry crimson. "I am a scholar, William. I understand the metrics of human capability." "No," Will said, stepping even closer until he was looking down into his uncle's face. "You understand how to keep people small so you can feel big. True education doesn't create a hierarchy, Thaddeus. It flattens it. Churning out a bunch of Latin phrases doesn't give you a character. It just gives you a vocabulary. Now, get off my porch before I forget you share my mother's blood." Stone opened his mouth to speak, but the absolute coldness in Will's eyes stopped him. He snapped his jaw shut, adjusted his spectacles with a trembling hand, and marched back to his buggy. The dust from his departure hung in the air long after the sound of his wheels died away. The porch returned to silence. The storm in the air seemed to have passed, leaving only the heavy heat. Abby sat frozen. Her heart was hammering against her ribs. She looked up at Will, her green eyes wide with a mixture of fear and confusion. "He hates me," she whispered. "He doesn't even know me, and he hates me." Mrs. Clara stood up from her corner. She walked over to the table, her heavy boots thudding softly against the wood. She laid a hand on Abby's shoulder, a rare, solid gesture of comfort. "He doesn't hate you because you're poor, Abby," Mrs. Clara said quietly. "He hates you because you're a threat." Abby frowned. "A threat? I'm just a girl who can't read a newspaper." Will sat down in the chair opposite her. He picked up the chalk slate, turning it over in his hands. "It's time you knew the whole truth, Abby," Will said. "Thaddeus Stone isn't just the town schoolmaster, he's my uncle. My mother's brother. When my father died 4 years ago, the ranch was in debt. The lawyers in Austin were circling like buzzards. Thaddeus tried to use his legal knowledge to strip the deed right out of my hands. He argued in court that an unrefined 21-year-old cowboy didn't have the intellectual capacity to run an estate this size. Abby gasped. Your own uncle. My own blood, Will said, his jaw tightening. He lost that fight because my father kept meticulous records. I learned how to read those records just in time to save myself. Thaddeus never forgave me for that. He took the schoolmaster job in town, because Alderman Booth pays him well to keep the town's ledger books under lock and key. He leaned closer, his eyes boring into hers. Think back to last week, Abby, Will said, before you came to this porch. You were hired to clean the town hall and the schoolhouse, weren't you? Yes, Abby said slowly. I swept the floors. I emptied the wash basins. Did you go near Thaddeus' desk? Abby's eyes widened as a memory clicked into place. There was a Wednesday night. I was sweeping late. He had left a big map on his desk. It was a blueprint of the county lines. There were red marks all over the western tract of Vance Ranch, right next to our little creek. He walked in and caught me looking at it. He snatched the paper away so fast he tore the corner. He looked terrified. Will nodded, a dark satisfaction settling onto his face. He thought you could read it, Will explained. His voice was low and deliberate. He didn't know you were illiterate. He assumed you were spying. That's why he humiliated you the next morning in front of the whole town. He wanted to discredit you. He wanted everyone to think you were a fool, so that if you ever spoke about what you saw on that map, nobody would believe a word out of your mouth. Abby felt a cold chill run down her spine, completely independent of the summer heat. Her lack of knowledge hadn't just been an embarrassment. It had been a vulnerability that her enemies had exploited. Will shoved the slateboard back into her hands. We rechanging the lessons today. Abby, he said firmly, no more simple stories about horses and rivers. You going to learn the language of the law. You going to learn what an affidavit is. You going to learn the word deed. You going to learn the word fraud. He pointed to the blank slate. Write the word contract, Will said. Look at the letters, memorize the shape of it. When a man puts a piece of paper in front of you, he isn't just showing you words. He's trying to bind your life to his terms. If you can't read the terms, you are a prisoner to his definition of the world. Tripping over a word in a classroom is embarrassing, Abby, but tripping over a word in a legal contract can cost you your freedom. Abby gripped the chalk. The fear was still there, but beneath it, a new feeling was taking root. It was a cold, sharp spark of anger. She pressed the chalk to the stone. She wrote the letters CNTRACT. She looked at the word. It didn't look like a snake anymore. It looked like a shield. By the first week of August, the Texas sun had bleached the prairie grass to a pale, brittle gold. But behind the Vance Ranch house, the herb garden was a vibrant oasis of green. Abby knelt in the rich, dark soil, her fingers working with an innate gentleness. She was pruning the lavender bushes, the sweet, clean scent rising around her like a protective cloud. She had found her footing here. In the mornings, she was a whirlwind of productivity, earning every cent of her 50-day wage. In the afternoons, she was a scholar. Will walked out to the garden, carrying a wooden bucket and a couple of books. He didn't sit on the porch today. He walked right out into the dirt and sat beneath the shade of the massive live oak tree that overhung the fence line. Bring your slate, Abby, he called out. Abby wiped her hands on her apron and walked over, sitting on a smooth stone near the trunk of the tree. The shade was a relief, dropping the temperature by 10 degrees. We're going to talk about botany today, Will said, opening a small text with detailed green illustrations. But we're going to do it your way first. Tell me about this lavender. Abby looked at the plant. It likes the gravel, she said simply. If you give it too much water, the roots turn black and it dies of rot. But if you leave it alone in the sun, it grows deep roots. It survives the winter frost because it knows how to hold on to the deep warmth of the earth. Will nodded, looking from the book to her. See what you just did, Will said. He pointed to the printed page. This book uses Latin names, Lavandula angustifolia. It talks soil drainage and moisture retention. It takes 3 paragraphs of academic jargon to say exactly what you just said in 3 sentences. He leaned back against the rough bark of the oak. The men who write these books think they own the knowledge because they own the press, Will said, his voice quiet and rhythmic. They think a university degree makes them closer to nature, but they wrong. You understand the essence of the plant because you worked it with your hands. The book just gives you the standardized labels. Don't ever confuse the label for the truth. Abby, the label is just the clothing. The truth is the body underneath. Abby smiled, a genuine, relaxed expression that lifted the corners of her eyes. She felt a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the sun. They sat close together, the book resting on the grass between them. When Will reached down to turn the page, his forearm brushed against her shoulder. It was a brief, accidental contact, but it felt like a jolt of electricity. Abby caught her breath. Will's hand froze for a fraction of a second on the edge of the paper. He didn't pull away immediately. He looked up, his dark eyes locking onto hers beneath the shadow of his hat. For a long moment, the only sound was the wind rustling through the dry oak leaves. Will cleared his throat, his face turning slightly serious as he pulled his hand back. Let's move on to some poetry, he said, his voice a bit rougher than usual. He pulled out a thin, well-worn volume. This is Walt Whitman. He writes about the common man. He writes about people like us. He turned to a marked page and handed the book to her. Read this line for me. Take it slow. Abby took the book. Her fingers touched the cool paper. She tracked the line with her thumb, her lips moving silently before she spoke the words aloud. For every atom, she read, her voice steadying as she gained confidence. Belonging to me is good, belongs to you. She stopped. She read the sentence again in her mind. What does it mean to you? Will asked, watching her intently. Abby looked up from the page, her green eyes bright. It means nobody is born better than anyone else, she said, her voice filled with a quiet conviction. It means the king and the dirt farmer are made of the exact same dust. The schoolmaster might have finer clothes, but his blood isn't any redder than my father's. That's exactly what it means, Will said, his voice soft but filled with an intense pride. It's a declaration of absolute human equality. The law might create titles, and banks might create classes, but the universe doesn't recognize them. You are an equal participant in this world, Abby. Don't ever let anyone make you feel like a guest in your own country. Before Abby could answer, the sound of carriage wheels interrupted the quiet of the afternoon. A high-set, polished canopy-top buggy pulled up to the front gate. Out stepped Eleanor Sterling, the daughter of the town's prominent cattle baron. She was dressed in an elaborate, pale blue silk day dress, her parasol held aloft to shade her milky complexion. She walked toward the garden with the confident stride of someone who owned every room she walked into. Abby instantly felt the sharp contrast. She looked down at her mud-stained apron and her rough, dirty fingernails. She instinctively pulled her feet back beneath her skirt. William, Eleanor called out, her voice sweet as molasses. Clara told me I might find you out here. I didn't realize you were occupied. Will stood up, stepping out from the shade of the tree. He took off his hat with a polite nod. Good afternoon, Eleanor. We read just finishing up a lesson. Eleanor walked up to the edge of the garden fence, her eyes sweeping over Abby with a calculated, indifferent curiosity. It wasn't an expression of overt malice. It was something worse, the look of a person looking at a piece of common yard furniture. How charming, Eleanor said, her smile never reaching her eyes. It is truly noble of you to spend your valuable time this way, William, but really the town is beginning to wonder if you lost your focus. The cattle buyers from St. Louis are arriving next week, and Father says you haven't even confirmed your inventory. She glanced back at Abby, her tone dripping with a polite, venomous condescension. One must wonder if certain investments are truly worth the expenditure of a busy man's energy. Some soil simply cannot yield a harvest, no matter how much water you pour into it. Abby felt the words like a physical slap. She stood up, her slate clutching her chest, ready to retreat to the kitchen. But Will didn't let her run. He reached out, his hand gently but firmly catching Abby's elbow, keeping her standing right next to him. He looked across the fence at Eleanor, his face hardening into a mask of pure, unyielding stone. The harvest is doing just fine, Eleanor, Will said, his voice dropping into a dangerous, icy register. In fact, I've never seen a mind grow faster. Miss Miller isn't an investment, she's a person. And as for the cattle buyers, tell your father I'll handle my business my way. I don't need a committee to tell me how to manage my ranch or my company. Eleanor's smile vanished. Her jaw tightened, her pale cheeks flushing with sudden embarrassment. She adjusted her parasol with a sharp, angry jerk. I see, Eleanor said coldly. I shall tell my father you are otherwise engaged. Good day, William. She turned on her heel and marched back to her buggy, her silk skirts rustling angrily against the dry grass. Will released Abby's elbow. He looked down at her. Abby was trembling slightly, but her head was still up. She looked at the book in her hand, then out at the retreating buggy. She thinks I don't belong here, Abby whispered. She thinks I am just dirt. Will took the book from her hand and set it gently back on the stone. He looked at her with an intensity that made her breath hitch. "It doesn't matter what she thinks, Abby," Will said, his voice ringing with absolute certainty. "Eleanor Sterling has never had to fight for a single thing in her entire life. Her world is made of glass, it looks bright, but it breaks the second you hit it with something real. You've been tested in the fire, and you still standing. That makes you more dangerous than any cattle baron in Texas." He picked up her slate board and handed it back to her. "Let's get back to work," Will said. "We have more words to conquer." Abby took the slate. She looked at the lavender rose, then up at the open sky. The thorns were sharp, but her roots were starting to run deep. By the middle of August, the heat had settled deep into the bones of Sweetwater Creek. The mornings were short, the afternoons were long. Baked dry expanses where the only movement was the dust devils dancing across the prairie. Abby had changed. You could see it in the way she carried herself. She didn't slip along the edges of the porch anymore. She walked straight down the center. Her head was up. When she went into town to pick up supplies for Mrs. Clara, she didn't look at the dirt. She looked at the signs. She read the labels on the dry goods: flour, sugar, Arbuckle's coffee. She was unlocking the world, one word at a time. But a ranch is a place of business, and business in the West is never just about the cattle or the grass. It is about the paper that binds them. It was a Monday evening. The sun had dipped below the western hills, leaving a long bleeding gash of red across the sky. Abby was sitting by the kitchen table, her fingers tracing a sentence in an old history book Will had lent her. The front screen door banged open. Abby looked up. Thomas Miller stood in the doorway. Her father. He looked smaller than usual. His flannel shirt was torn at the shoulder. His face was flushed, his eyes bloodshot and watery. He smelled of cheap, sour rye whiskey. He didn't look at her. He looked at his own boots. "Abby," Thomas muttered. His voice was thick, unsteady. "Get your coat." Will Vance came out of the back office. He had a kerosene lamp in his hand. The yellow light caught the hard angles of his jaw. He set the lamp on the sideboard. "Thomas," Will said. His voice was flat. "A warning. You're early. The girl's shift doesn't end until 8 on Mondays." Thomas wiped his mouth with the back of a trembling hand. He leaned against the doorframe to steady himself. "She's done here, Vance. She's done for good. I am taking her home." Abby stood up. The history book closed with a soft thud. "Father, what's wrong? Is one of the little ones sick?" "Ain't nobody sick," Thomas snapped, his eyes flashing with a sudden defensive anger. "But a man's got a right to his own family. You've got no business staying in a grand house like this, playing at being a lady. We got debts, Abby, real debts." Will didn't move from his spot by the sideboard. He didn't pull his pistol. He just folded his arms across his chest. "What did you do, Thomas?" Will asked. His voice dropped to a dangerous quiet register. "You were down at Jebediah Crawford's place last night. I saw your mule hitched outside his office." Thomas flinched. He looked away, his jaw working silently. "I did what I had to do," Thomas whispered. "The land, the drought took the corn. The bank was coming for the mule, Crawford. He offered a way out, a clean slate." He reached into his coat pocket. He pulled out a folded piece of heavy parchment. The paper was crisp. It had a red wax seal at the bottom. "It's an indenture," Thomas said, his voice cracking. He held it out toward Will, but his hand was shaking so badly the paper rattled. 5 years. Abby works for Crawford as household. To pay off the debt. It's all legal, Vance. Signed and notarized by Alderman Booth himself. The law says a father has the right to bind his children's labor until they're of age. Abby felt the air leave her lungs. The kitchen seemed to tilt. Indentured servitude. She knew the word. Will had taught it to her only a week ago. It was a legal term for a lifetime of slavery wrapped up in a 5-year contract. It meant 5 years in Crawford's house. A man known for his cruelty, a man who broke his horses and his workers with the same heavy hand. "Father, no." Abby breathed. She took a step back, her hands reaching for the edge of the kitchen table. "You didn't. You couldn't. I had to," Thomas shouted, his face turning an ugly, bruised purple. "We'd starve otherwise, Abby. You re-18. You can work, it's just 5 years. Then you re-free." Will Vance stepped between Thomas and Abby. He took the parchment from Thomas's hand. He didn't tear it. He unfolded it under the lamplight. His eyes scanned the lines of tiny, cramped ink. "You miserable coward," Will said. His voice wasn't loud. It was skin-crawlingly soft. "You drank away your corn money at the saloon. And when Crawford called the debt, you traded your daughter's life to save your own skin." "The law says I can," Thomas yelled, his voice rising in panic. "The law says my signature is binding." Will folded the paper back up. He didn't give it back. He slid it into his own pocket. "The law is a tool, Thomas," Will said, his eyes drilling into the older man. It isn't a shield for cowards. A man who signs away his own child's freedom to cover his own vice isn't a man at all. He's just a predator wearing a coat now. Get off my ranch, before I show you what the law of the prairie looks like. Thomas looked at Will. He saw the absolute lack of mercy in the young rancher's eyes. He swallowed hard, turned on his heel, and stumbled out into the dark. The kitchen was silent again, save for the ticking of the clock. Abby sank into a chair. She buried her face in her hands. Her shoulders shook, but she didn't let the sound out. The shame was a physical weight, pressing her down into the wood. Her own father, he had sold her, like a sack of grain, like a broken-down mule. Will sat down across from her. He didn't reach out to touch her hand. He knew her pride wouldn't bear it right now. He signed it, Will, Abby whispered into her palms. The law says his name makes it real. I have to go to Crawford S. house. If I don't, the sheriff will come with handcuffs. Look at me, Abby, Will said. She lifted her head. Her green eyes were bright with unshed tears. The law isn't a god, Abby, Will said, his voice firm and steady. It's just a machine made by men. And like any machine made by men, it has flaws. It has gears that can be jammed if you know where to stick the iron. Your father signed that paper. Yes, but a contract isn't valid just because one man puts his mark on it. A contract requires mutual consideration. It requires lawful execution. He leaned forward, his face illuminated by the yellow glow of the lamp. If you run away right now, Will said, you become a fugitive. The law will hunt you down because you broke the agreement. Crawford would have the legal right to use the county authorities to bring you back. Running is a losing game. It gives your enemy the moral high ground. Abby wiped her eyes with her sleeve. Then what do? I don't know how to fight a piece of paper. Will looked out the window into the dark Texas night. You don't fight it with a gun, Will said quietly. You fight it with the exact same ink they used to write it. We have 2 weeks before the contract takes effect on the 1st of September. In those 2 weeks, you aren't just going to learn to read stories. You're going to study that contract until you know every punctuation mark. You're going to learn how to find the hole in their net. He stood up and walked over to the door, looking out into the shadows. They think you're an illiterate girl, Abby, Will said, his voice a low, fierce murmur. They think you're a sheep they can herd into any pen they choose. That's their mistake. They don't know you have the key. We're going to open that cage from the inside. Abby looked down at the history book on the table. The letters didn't look like ghosts anymore. They looked like soldiers, and she was going to learn how to command them. The rain came on a Wednesday afternoon, a sudden, violent summer deluge that turned the red roads of Sweetwater Creek into thick, sucking clay. It lasted an hour, leaving the air smelling of ozone and wet stone. By 4 o'clock the storm had passed, leaving the sun to bake the damp earth into a heavy mist. Abby walked out to the western tract of the ranch, near the boundary line where the Vance land met the creek. She was carrying a wicker basket, looking for wild elderberries that grew along the water. The ground was slick. Her boots sank an inch into the mud with every step. Near the base of a limestone ridge she stopped. The rain had washed away the top layer of sandy soil, exposing a deep trench in the earth. At the bottom of the trench, the water puddling in the clay looked wrong. It wasn't clear. It had a thick, greasy sheen on the surface, an oily rainbow that shimmered in the late afternoon light. Abby knelt. She dipped her fingers into the puddle. The water was slick. It smelled sharp, pungent. It smelled like sulfur and old kerosene. She wiped her fingers on a stone, but the dark, black stain remained. It didn't wash away with water. A memory flash came to her. 3 years ago, she had been a little girl helping her mother carry laundry past Jebediah Crawford's northern pasture. She had seen that exact same black muck oozing out of a bog. Within 6 months, Crawford had built 3 large timber derricks on that spot. He had become the richest man in the county. Oil, Vang Den, black gold. Abby stood up, her heart jumping. She looked up at the ridge. The Vance land didn't just have grass. It had the wealth of the earth buried beneath the limestone. Don't touch that stuff, Miss Miller. It's bad for the skin. Abby spun around. A man was standing near the brush line. He wasn't a cowboy. He wore a heavy wool suit, despite the heat, and carried a brass transit level on a wooden tripod. His boots were caked in mud. Behind him, stepping out from the shadows of the post oaks, was Thaddeus Stone. The schoolmaster adjusted his spectacles. He looked at Abby's muddy hands, then down at the greasy puddle. A tight, ugly smile crossed his face. You're a long way from the kitchen, girl, Stone said. His voice was smooth, but his eyes were sharp as skinning knives. This is property. It is William Vance's property, Abby said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her knees. For now, Stone said softly. He tapped his cane against his boot, but boundaries change. The law has a way of moving fences when the paperwork isn't properly maintained. A ranch this size, it requires a great deal of oversight an uneducated cowboy simply cannot provide. The man with the transit level began adjusting the brass dials, aiming his sight across the creek toward the Miller family's cabin. "You see, Miss Miller," Stone said, taking a step closer until Abby could smell the peppermint on his breath. "The world is changing. The age of the cattle is ending. The age of the machine is here, and machines require oil. The land you're standing on belongs to a larger plan. A plan orchestrated by men who can read a map, not men who can only rope a steer." Abby looked from Stone to the transit level. She understood now. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place. The blueprint on Stone's desk, the red marks along the creek, the sudden interest in her father's gambling debts, the indenture contract. It wasn't about her father's money. It wasn't even about her working in Crawford's kitchen. They wanted her out of the way. They wanted her father's land, and they wanted Will S. Ranch. If they could force her into indenture, she would be Crawford's property for 5 years. She wouldn't be able to speak. She wouldn't be able to testify in court about the oil she had found, and Thomas Miller, desperate for whiskey money, would sign away his creekside land without ever knowing what was beneath the mud. "You're surveying," Abby said clearly. "You're moving the boundary markers." Stone chuckled, a dry, rattling sound, a grand accusation from a girl who can't even read a surveyor's report. "Go back to your pots, Miss Miller. Leave the land to the men who own the words." Abby didn't argue. She turned and walked back toward the main house. She didn't run, but her steps were fast. Her chest was burning. When she reached the ranch house, Will was in the yard, checking the cinch on his saddle. Abby walked right up to him. She didn't look at Mrs. Clara, who was watching from the porch. She held out her black-stained hands. "Look at this, Will," she said, her breath coming in short gasps. Will caught her wrists. He looked at the black grease on her fingers. He smelled her hands. His eyes went wide. "Where did you find this?" "The western ridge," Abby said. "Near the creek. The rain washed the dirt away. And Will, Thaddeus Stone is out there. He's got a surveyor with him. They remeasuring the lines. They think I don't know what it means. They think because I'm a miller, I can't see what they're trying to steal." Will dropped his hands. He looked out toward the ridge, his face darkening until he looked like the storm clouds that had just passed. "They trying to squeeze me out," Will said, his voice a low vibrate. "They know the oil is here. If they can alter the survey records at the county office before the St. Louis buyers get here next week, they can claim the western tract as public land. Then Alderman Booth can auction it off to Crawford for pennies." He looked back at her, his expression a mix of anger and profound respect. "You just found their leverage, Abby," Will said. "They needed you in that indenture contract because an indentured servant cannot legally hold property or lodge a formal complaint against a landowner in the state of Texas. If you're bound to Crawford, your voice doesn't exist in a court of law. You become legally dead for 5 years." Abby looked down at her hands. The black grease was stubborn. It had settled into the creases of her skin. "Then we used the words," Abby said. Her voice was quiet, but it had the ring of cold iron. "You told me the law is a machine. You told me we could find the hole in their net. Show me the contract, Will. Show me the paperwork they made my father sign. I want to read every single letter." Will smiled. It wasn't his usual polite smile. It was the smile of a man who had just been handed a loaded Winchester in a tight spot. "Let's go inside, Abby," Will said. "The schoolmaster thinks he owns the language. It's time we showed him that the alphabet belongs to everyone." They walked onto the porch, the heavy oak door closing behind them as the first stars began to pierce the Texas sky. The battle wasn't on the prairie anymore. It was on the page. The 1st of September arrived with a stillness that made the prairie feel like an empty church. The heat hadn't broken. It had just turned gray, a heavy haze hanging over the cedar breaks. At 10 o'clock in the morning, the dust rose on the road from town. A heavy, black-topped carriage pulled into the courtyard of Vance Ranch. Behind it rode 2 men on horseback, Winchesters resting across their knees. Jebediah Crawford stepped down from the carriage. He was a massive man, built like an old bull, his skin dark as walnut casing. He didn't wear a fancy suit like Thaddeus Stone. He wore greasy leather vestments and a wide straw hat. His voice, when he spoke, sounded like iron tires grinding over river gravel. "William," Crawford barked. He didn't come to the porch. He stood in the dirt, his heavy boots planted wide. "Bring the girl out." The front screen door pushed open. Will Vance stepped out first. He didn't have his rifle in his hand, but his right arm hung loose and low by his holster. Abby walked out right behind him. Her face was pale, but her hands were steady. She wore her best gray cotton dress. In her fingers she clutched a folded piece of paper. Mrs. Clara followed, standing by the door with her arms crossed over her apron. "You're making a racket in my yard, Jebediah," Will said. His voice was a soft rumble, low and even. Crawford reached into his vest. He pulled out a duplicate copy of the indenture parchment, the red wax seal glinting in the dull light. "I am here for my property, Vance. The paper says Thomas Miller traded his daughter's labor for 5 years to settle his account. The law gives me the right to enforce this contract on the first day of the month. If she doesn't get into that carriage, my men will put her in it. The sheriff is already notified." Will didn't flinch. He leaned against the porch railing, his eyes dark. "A contract is a heavy thing, Jebediah. You sure you want to lift it? The law says it's binding." Crawford sneered. He held the parchment toward Abby. "Come on, girl. Don't make this difficult. Your daddy drank his corn away. And you're the payment. Sign the verification ledger right here, and let's go." One of the riders chuckled, shifting his weight in the saddle. Will turned his head slightly, looking at Abby. He didn't say a word. He didn't give her a sign. He just stepped back, leaving the center of the porch wide open for her. Abby took 3 steps forward. Her boots clattered softly against the pine boards. She looked down at the massive man in the dirt. Her green eyes were perfectly calm. "Let me see the parchment, Mr. Crawford," Abby said. Her voice didn't shake. It was clear. It carried across the quiet yard. Crawford laughed, a harsh, dry sound. "See it? What for? You can't even read a sign on a barn door, girl. Just make your mark at the bottom. An X is all the law requires from a miller." "Hand it to me," she repeated. Crawford grunted, stepping up to the first porch step and shoving the paper into her hand. He thought it was a game. He thought she was just stalling. Abby unfolded the heavy parchment. The lines of tiny, cramped ink stretched out before her. For a split second, her mind flashed back to the green Bible in the mud. She felt the cold sweat start at the back of her neck. But then she smelled the rosemary from the garden behind the house. She felt the solid wood beneath her boots. The shapes on the page stopped dancing. They froze. They became tools. She began to read, out loud. Her voice was slow, rhythmic, measuring every syllable. "Indenture agreement. Entered this 15th day of August, between Thomas Miller, party of the first part, and Jebediah Crawford, party of the second part." Crawford's smile faltered. His heavy eyebrows came together. The writer stopped smiling. Abby didn't stop. Her thumb tracked down the page, moving past the definitions of labor, past the clauses regarding room and board, straight to the small, cramped paragraph at the bottom. Section 7. The part Will had spent 3 nights drilling into her memory until she could see it with her eyes closed. Section 7. Abby read, her voice growing stronger with every word. "This covenant is valid only when executed in the presence of a neutral witness, who holds no financial interest in either party." She stopped. She lowered the paper, looking directly into Crawford's dark face. "The witness listed at the bottom of this page is Thaddeus Stone," Abby said. "The law defines a neutral witness as someone who gains nothing from the enforcement of the contract. But Mr. Stone is the uncle of William Vance, and he is currently under contract with Alderman Booth to survey the Western Ridge for oil development. If I am removed from this ranch under this indenture, Mr. Stone's financial associates gain immediate access to the Vance boundary lines." Crawford's face turned from brown to an ugly, mottled gray. You don't know what you're talking about. A girl can't just throw out a notary seal." "I'm not throwing it out," Abby said, her voice like iron. "The law is throwing it out. Section 7 says that if the witness is found to have a financial stake, the document is void ab initio. That means it was dead before it ever touched the paper. This contract isn't an agreement, Mr. Crawford. It's a fraud, and the law says a fraud cannot be enforced by the sheriff or anyone else." The yard went completely silent. You could hear a grasshopper clicking in the dry weeds by the fence. Crawford looked up at Will Vance. Will hadn't moved his hand from his holster. His face was a mask of cold satisfaction. "She read it, Jebediah," Will said softly. "Every single word. If you or your men touch her now, you aren't enforcing a debt, you re-kidnapping a free citizen of the state of Texas. And the law allows a man to defend his property and his people from kidnappers with whatever force is necessary." The rider on the left looked at Crawford, his hand shifting away from his Winchester. "Jeb," he muttered, "this ain't what you said it was. The girl's talking like a lawyer from Austin." Crawford snapped his jaw shut. He snatched the duplicate copy back from Abby's hand, his fingers tearing the edge of the parchment. He looked at her with a hatred that was pure and unfiltered. "This ain't over, Vance. Crawford spat, turning back toward his carriage. The schoolmaster has the county records. Churning out a few fancy phrases won't save your land. We'll see about that, Will said. The carriage turned around, its heavy wheels throwing up a thick screen of red dust as it tore down the driveway. The riders followed close behind, their horses galloping hard. Abby stood on the porch, her chest heaving. The parchment she had held was gone, but her hands were still out. She looked at Will. "I did it," she whispered. "I read the words. I stopped him." Will stepped up beside her. He looked out at the dust trail on the road. "You didn't just stop him, Abby," Will said, his voice rich with an uncharacteristic emotion. "You proved that power doesn't belong to the man with the loudest voice or the biggest carriage. It belongs to the person who knows how to read the rules of the game. You saved your own life today. Nobody else did it for you." Mrs. Clara walked over, took the slate board from the porch table, and handed it to Abby with a rare approving nod. "The kitchen floor still needs sweeping," she said, her voice gruff but her eyes soft. "But you can do it with your head up today." Abby smiled, the tightness in her chest melting away into the clean Texas air. She had found her weapon. The shadow of the big live oak tree stretched long and thin across the western pasture. It was late afternoon, 2 days after Crawford's carriage had driven away in defeat. The air was dry, carrying the sharp scent of parched earth and distant cedar smoke. Will had done something unusual. He had told Abby to leave her apron in the kitchen, saddle her pony, and ride out with him to the river bend. They rode in silence for a mile, the horses' hooves thudding softly in the dry grass. They stopped where the creek narrowed, the water running shallow over gray limestone slabs. This was the boundary line. On one side lay Vance Ranch, on the other the small, scrubby parcel that belonged to Thomas Miller. Will dismounted, tying his horse to a mesquite branch. Abby followed him, sitting down on a smooth shelf of rock near the water's edge. "You've been quiet since Tuesday," Will said, looking down at the clear shallow stream. Abby pulled her knees up to her chest, her skirt tucked around her boots. "I've been thinking," she said, "about how everything fits together, the maps, the oil, the contract." She looked up at him, her green eyes clear and sharp in the fading light. "There's one piece that doesn't fit, Will," she said. Will sat down on the rock next to her, leaving a respectful distance between them. He took off his hat, letting the cool evening breeze stir his dark hair. "What's that?" "My father didn't go to Crawford's office until the middle of August," Abby said, her voice dropping into a rhythmic, measured tone. "But you came to our cabin in June. The very night Thaddeus Stone chased me out of the schoolhouse. You offered me double the going rate. You insisted on teaching me how to read." She leaned forward, her gaze locking onto his face. "You already knew about the contract, didn't you?" she asked. "You knew what my father was planning before he ever signed that paper." Silence stretched between them, save for the low gurgle of the creek over the stones. Will didn't look away. He held her gaze, his face completely unreadable for a long moment. "I knew," Will said quietly. Abby felt a cold knot form in her stomach. "Why didn't you tell me? If you were my friend, if you were trying to help me, why keep it a secret?" Will picked up a small piece of limestone and tossed it into the water. It made a sharp, clean splash. "Because if I told you in June, you would have panicked," Will said, turning to face her fully. "You were 18, terrified, and convinced you were stupid because Thaddeus Stone had just humiliated you in front of the whole town. If I told you your father had traded your life away, you would have hopped on that pony and run for the hills. Do you know what happens to a person who flees an indenture contract in the state of Texas?" Abby shook her head, her lips tight. "The law treats you like a horse thief," Will said, his voice dropping into an intense authoritative register. "The county court issues a fugitive labor warrant. The sheriff handles it like a criminal matter. If they catch you, and they always catch you, you're brought back in irons. The time you spent running is added to your sentence. And the landowner has the legal right to restrict your movements entirely. Running away wouldn't have saved you. It would have made you a criminal." He reached out, his hand hovering over hers for a fraction of a second before he pulled it back, respecting her space. "I didn't have the money to buy out the debt cleanly," Will explained. "Not with Alderman Booth freezing my bank credits. The only way to save you was to make you legally capable of saving yourself. I had to teach you how to read the text so you could find the flaw in their execution. I couldn't do it for you, Abby." In a Texas court, a wealthy rancher defending a poor girl looks like a land grab, but a free woman standing up and reading her own rights. That's something even a corrupt judge can't ignore. Abby looked out over the shallow water. Her anger was a hot, sharp thing, But as she listened to his voice, it began to shape itself into something else, understanding. He hadn't treated her like a charity case. He hadn't treated her like a helpless victim who needed a cowboy to ride in with a gun and settle the score. He had treated her like an equal. He had given her the only tool that mattered. "You took a big risk," Abby murmured. "If I had been too slow, if I hadn't found Section 7, Crawford would have taken me anyway. I knew you wouldn't fail," Will said. His voice was incredibly soft, softer than she had ever heard it. "I watched you in that garden, Abby. I watched you with the horse. You don't give up. You have more grit in your little finger than Eleanor Sterling and her whole family have in their bank accounts." He turned his head, looking at her profile in the golden light of the setting sun. "I told myself I started this because I hated Thaddeus and Crawford," Will whispered. "I told myself it was just business, a way to protect my borders, but I'd be a liar if I said that's why I kept going." Abby felt her throat go dry. Her heart did that strange, familiar hammer thud against her ribs. She didn't look down. She turned her head and looked right into his eyes. "Why did you keep going, Will?" Will didn't move closer, but the space between them seemed to vanish. "Because every afternoon at 3 o'clock, I got to sit across from a woman who looks at the world and sees the truth of it," Will said, his dark eyes filled with a fierce, quiet devotion. "I spent 4 years in Boston surrounded by people who used education like clothing to hide how small they were. But you use it like a lamp. You're the brightest thing in this county, Abby. And I don't want to imagine this ranch without you standing on the porch." The twilight was falling fast now, the sky turning a deep velvet blue. A lone nighthawk swept low over the water, its wings cutting through the dusk. Abby looked at his hand resting on the limestone shelf. Slowly, deliberately, she moved her own hand forward. Her fingers brushed against his skin was warm, rough from the ropes and the reins. But his grip was incredibly gentle as his fingers slid between hers, locking them together. "I'm not going anywhere, Will," Abby said. Her voice was barely a whisper, but it was absolute. "For the first time in my life, I know exactly where I belong, and it's not in the mud." "No," Will said, his fingers tightening around hers with a quiet promise. "It sure as hell isn't." They sat together on the stone shelf as the stars began to appear, one by one, reflecting in the clear running water of the creek. They didn't kiss. They didn't need to. The contract between them wasn't written on parchment, and it didn't need a notary seal. It was built on the rock, and it was going to stay there. The second week of September brought a change to the wind. It blew from the north, sharp and clean, chasing the gray haze out of the valley. But the peace didn't last. On Thursday morning, a deputy rode into the Vance courtyard. He didn't dismount. He handed Will a folded piece of paper with the county seal, a summons. Jebediah Crawford and Thaddeus Stone had filed an emergency injunction at the courthouse. They claimed the indenture contract was valid. They claimed Abby's signature had been forged on her refusal notice. They were demanding an immediate hearing before the county judge. In 48 hours, Will stood on the porch, the paper crumpled in his fist. He looked out at the road. "They're trying to force the issue before the St. Louis buyers get here," he said, his voice flat. "If they can tie you up in a legal dispute, the buyers won't touch the land. Capitalists hate an unclear title." Abby walked out of the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. She looked at the deputy's retreating dust. "Then we don't let them tie us up," she said. She walked past Will, straight into his office. She sat down at the heavy oak desk. She didn't wait for him to invite her. She pulled a clean sheet of foolscap paper toward her. She took the inkwell and the steel-nibbed pen. "What are you doing, Abby?" Will asked, standing in the doorway. "I'm writing my statement," she said. Her voice was steady. "You told me the law is a machine. You told me we fight them with the same ink they use to write their lies. I'm going to tell the judge exactly what I saw on that map and exactly what I found in the mud." Will walked over. He didn't take the pen from her hand. He sat in the chair beside her, his long legs crossed, his face filled with a quiet intensity. "An affidavit has to be precise, Abby. Every word must be a fact, no feelings, no guesses. The court only recognizes admissible evidence." "I know," Abby said. She dipped the pen into the black ink. She paused. The white paper was wide and bright beneath the lamp. For a second her mind tried to wander. She saw the schoolhouse. She saw Thaddeus Stone, a sneering face. "Go back to your pigs." She shook her head. The image broke. She pressed the steel nib to the paper. Her hand was firm. Her strokes were bold, clean and even. "I, Abigail Jane Miller, being of sound mind," she wrote for 3 hours. She didn't ask Will how to spell the big words. She had memorized them from the legal ledgers. She described the black sludge on the western ridge. She described the survey markers Thaddeus Stone had moved. She described the conflict of interest in Section 7 of the indenture contract. When she was finished, she blew on the ink to dry it. She signed her name at the bottom, neat, symmetrical, Abigail Jane Miller. Will picked up the paper. He read it through, twice when he looked up. His dark eyes were shining with a fierce, prideful light. "This isn't just a statement, Abby," Will said, his voice a low vibrate. "This is a trap. You've laid out the facts so cleanly that if the judge ignores this, he's violating his own oath of office. You've turned their own system against them." Friday morning. The county courthouse in Sweetwater Creek was packed to the doors. The air inside was hot, smelling of old leather, unwashed wool, and political tension. Alderman Booth sat at the front table, his fat fingers tapping against his gold pocket watch. Beside him sat Jebediah Crawford and Thaddeus Stone. Stone wore a fresh white collar, looking confident, his spectacles shining under the courtroom lanterns. Judge Silas Vance, no relation to Will, but an old-timer who had held the bench for 20 years, sat behind the elevated pine desk. He looked tired, his gray beard was uncombed, and his eyes were bloodshot. "Let's get this settled," the judge grunted, rapping his wooden gavel once. "Mr. Crawford claims an infraction of a labor agreement. He says the Miller girl is refusing a lawful indenture, Mr. Stone testifies the paperwork was regular." Thaddeus Stone stood up, smoothing his waistcoat. "Your Honor," he said, his voice carrying that familiar, educated Boston cadence, "the contract is entirely standard. The young woman in question is, unfortunately, illiterate. She does not understand the nature of a legal obligation. Her refusal is simply the result of outside influence from my nephew, William." Abby stood up from the back row. She didn't wait for Will to speak for her. She walked down the center aisle, her boots clicking firmly against the floorboards. She didn't look at the crowd. She didn't look at her father, who was sitting in the third row with his head down. She walked right up to the judge's bench. She laid her handwritten affidavit on the wood. "I am not illiterate, Your Honor," Abby said. Her voice was calm. It wasn't loud, but it filled the courtroom like a bell. Stone laughed, a short, patronizing snort. "A child can make marks on a page, Miss Miller. That doesn't mean you understand the law." "I understand Section 7, Abby said, turning her head slightly to look right at Stone. "And I understand the penal code of the state of Texas regarding the falsification of public land surveys." She looked back up at the judge. "That paper on your desk is my sworn statement," Abby said clearly. "I wrote it myself, every word. I am prepared to sit at that table, take a blank sheet of paper, and write my name before this court. Then, Your Honor, you can compare my handwriting to the signature on the verification ledger Mr. Crawford submitted. You will see that the mark on his document was made by a hand that doesn't know how to hold a pen." Judge Silas Vance picked up her statement. He adjusted his reading glasses. He read the 3 pages in total silence. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the flies buzzing against the window panes. The judge looked at the statement. Then he looked at Crawford's ledger. His old eyes narrowed. "Mr. Stone," the judge said, his voice dropping into a hard, dangerous register, "this affidavit describes a survey level placed on the western boundary of Vance Ranch on the afternoon of August 16th. It lists the coordinates you were recording, coordinates that match a mineral deposit report filed in Austin 3 weeks ago by a private syndicate." Stone's face went white. He clutched his cane. "Your Honor, that is entirely circumstantial." "Shut up, Thaddeus," the judge barked. He slammed his gavel down with a crack that sounded like a pistol shot. "This girl just laid out a prima facie case of fraud. She has given me dates, names, and a clear legal definition of a conflict of interest. The indenture contract is hereby declared null and void. Furthermore, I am ordering the county sheriff to seize the survey books from the schoolmaster's office for a full investigation by the state land commissioner." Crawford stood up, his face an ugly dark purple. "You can't do that, Silas. The debt is a civil matter between you and Thomas Miller." The judge shouted him down. "Go sue him for his mule, Jebediah." "But you're done with the girl. This court is adjourned." The room erupted into a roar of chatter. Alderman Booth was already out the side door, cutting his ties to Stone before the ink was dry on the order. Crawford turned and stormed out, his heavy boots shaking the floor. Abby stood by the bench. She didn't cheer. She didn't smile. She just picked up her pen from the table and slid it into her satchel. Will Vance stepped up beside her. He didn't say anything. He just put his hat back on his head, his eyes shining with an unspoken, fierce reverence. They walked out of the courthouse together, their shoulders brushing in the doorway. They were equal partners now. The paperwork had been settled, but the real work was just beginning. Muahe num 1879. 1 year later. The summer sun was just as hot, but the town of Sweetwater Creek looked different. A new timber derrick stood on the western ridge of Vance Ranch, its iron pump rhythmically drawing the dark wealth from the earth. The profits didn't go to Alderman Booth or Jebediah Crawford. They went into a new brick building on the corner of Main Street, the Sweetwater Evening School. It was a Monday night. The air was cool as the twilight settled over the prairie. Inside the schoolhouse, 6 kerosene lamps hung from the ceiling beams, casting a warm golden glow over the wooden desks. Abby Miller stood at the front blackboard. She wore a simple, elegant dark green dress. Her hair was pinned back neatly. She held a piece of white chalk in her fingers. Sitting in the front row was a group of 7 adults, men with calloused hands, women with tired eyes and worn aprons, dirt farmers, laborers, people who had spent their whole lives looking at the ground. Among them sat Thomas Miller. He had a clean slate in his lap. His face was sober, his eyes clear for the first time in 10 years. He looked up at his daughter, not with anger or shame, but with a quiet, hesitant hope. Abby turned to the board. She drew a large, perfect letter A. She turned back to face the room. Her voice was calm, rhythmic, and filled with a deep, certain authority. "Education isn't a gift that the wealthy hand down to the poor," Abby said, looking into every face in the room. "It isn't a privilege meant for the folks who live in grand houses in Boston. It is a right. It belongs to every human being who draws breath under this Texas sky. Chasing a person out of a schoolhouse doesn't make them ignorant. It just makes the schoolhouse smaller." She walked down the aisle, standing beside an old farmer whose hands were stiff from 40 years of guiding a plow. "We don't start with Latin phrases," Abby said softly, laying a hand on his shoulder. "We start with what you know. We start with the land. We start with the names of your children. Churning out words isn't about proving you read better than your neighbor. It's about building a shield so nobody can ever use a piece of paper to take away your dignity." She walked back to the front. She handed the chalk to the old farmer. "Draw the line," she said. "Take your time. The paper doesn't own you anymore." Outside the open window, the night was vast and full of stars. William Vance leaned against the wooden fence line, his horse hitched to the post beside him. He didn't come inside. He didn't need to. This was Abby's room. This was her harvest. Mrs. Clara stood beside him, her arms folded over her apron, her rocking chair back at the ranch finally still. "She's a real teacher, William," Mrs. Clara whispered in the dark. Will watched Abby guide the old farmer's hand across the slate. A slow, beautiful smile broke across his rugged face. "No, Clara," Will said, his voice a low, prideful rumble that carried into the Texas night. "She isn't just a teacher. She's the person who changed the definition of the word." Inside, the lamps burned bright against the dark prairie, and the first letters of a new story began to take root in the soil. The opinions, actions, and decisions expressed by the characters in this story do not reflect the views or beliefs of the author. Certain scenes may contain dramatic situations, emotional conflict, or morally complex behavior intended solely to serve the fictional storyline and enhance the audience viewing experience.
And so, as the lamps burn bright inside the Sweetwater Evening School and the Texas night stretches wide beyond the windows, this story leaves us with a lesson that reaches far beyond one girl, one ranch, or one dusty town. It reminds us that education is not a privilege reserved for the rich, the polished, or the powerful. Education is a birthright. It is a lantern placed in the hands of every soul who has ever been told to stay in the dark. Abby Miller began her journey as a girl the world had already judged. To her father, she was labor. To Thaddeus Stone, she was ignorance. To men like Crawford, she was a signature waiting to be stolen. A life that could be bound by paper she was never meant to understand. But Abby's story proves that a person is not defined by what they do not know. A person is defined by the courage to learn, the strength to rise after humiliation, and the will to claim the words that others tried to use against them. The greatest cruelty in this story was not poverty. It was the belief that poverty should keep a person small. Thaddeus Stone used education like a gate, locking others out so he could feel tall standing inside. But William Vance understood the truth.
Knowledge is not a whip for the proud. It is a key for the trapped. A real teacher does not use learning to shame the weak. A real teacher uses it to help the forgotten stand upright.
William did not save Abby by fighting every battle for her. He saved her by teaching her how to fight for herself. That is one of the deepest meanings of this story. True love does not make someone dependent. True love strengthens them until they can speak their own name, read their own rights, and walk into a courtroom without bowing their head.
Abby's victory was not just that she defeated a false contract. Her real victory was that she stopped seeing herself through the eyes of cruel men. The letters that once looked like snakes became shields. The words that once brought back grief became tools of freedom. And the girl who was told to go back to the mud became the woman who opened a school for every tired hand, every bent back, and every forgotten mind in Sweetwater Creek. This story also reminds us that the law, money, and education can all be used for good or evil. In the hands of selfish men, they become chains. In the hands of the brave, they become instruments of justice. A contract can enslave, but understanding that contract can set a person free. A schoolhouse can humiliate, but a true classroom can heal a whole town. By the end, Abby does not simply learn to read. She changes the meaning of reading for everyone around her. She turns knowledge into protection. She turns shame into service. She turns pain into purpose. And perhaps that is the most powerful lesson of all. When one person rises from the dust, they can become the reason others rise too. So when we remember Abby standing at that blackboard, drawing the first letter for men and women who had spent their lives looking at the ground, we are reminded that no one is too old, too poor, too broken, or too forgotten to begin again. The world may try to tell us where we belong. It may call us mud, labor, weakness, or silence. But the human spirit was not made to stay buried. With courage, patience, and the right person willing to light the first lamp, even the most wounded soul can learn to read the road ahead. And that is the heart of this story. Dignity begins the moment we stop believing the lies spoken over us. And freedom begins the moment we learn to write our own truth.